Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Independent Activist broadcast here from Belfast. I'm joined today by Dr. Syed Moshin Abbas. He is a broadcaster and journalist specializing in the Islamic world affairs. Syed, thank you very much for joining us. I just want to remind people to maybe hit the subscribe button, the like, the share, and the notifications just to try and build up an audience going forward. We first met about, a year ago, maybe slightly longer, in London, and I've watched you several times on Press TV and some other broadcasting outlets. And the reason why I wanted to chat to you today was because I was lucky enough to go to Karbala in Iraq in August during Arbeen, which is the Islamic pilgrimage to the sites in Najaf and Karbala of Imam Ali in Najaf and Imam Hussein in Karbala, and 26 million people go there. I wasn't there for the pilgrimage, but I was there for a conference on Palestine. And obviously, when you're away, you get to meet people, you get to talk to people, you get to share ideas. And I find myself becoming increasingly interested in the Islamic view when it comes specifically to equality, oppression, and justice. So perhaps from your perspective as a broadcaster and journalist specializing in Islamic affairs, you could maybe share with everybody those three tenets of the Quran and the Islamic faith, which talk about basically what I would think of as humanity.
Yes, thank you for inviting me, Brian. A fascinating topic. I couldn't resist saying yes straight away because it is a really important thing for people to get a grip of, because most of the narrative around Islam, of course, in the latter part of the 20th century and definitely now, has been hijacked largely by imperialist, neoliberal propaganda agencies, literally states. The corporate media, all of them have been involved in really packaging Islam in a way that would be suitable for their political and economic motives around the world. And usually that's been painting it in a very, very bad light. And there have been phenomena like, of course, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the 9/11, etc. Incidents, which have also framed a kind of an attitude towards Islam, which is largely one of fear, I would say now, because it's been so incessant that Islamophobia, if you accept such a term, has become a thing. I mean, people, whilst they would have known nothing about Islam in the 70s when I was growing up here in England, there may have been racism, but there certainly was no understanding about Islam or religion. It was just a non-understood thing in the West, in reality, apart from academic circles. So the Islam which has been introduced to the West is a highly false one, as far as I can say, and it's a highly poisonous one. And it's one which actually is shaping conflict around the world. It's fueling conflict, and it's designed to be that way. And that's exactly why it was framed in such a way, to create conflict and to create opportunities for what I would say is transnational corporations, for structural elite that run most affairs around the world, especially those based in the Anglo-Zionist sphere of influence here in the West. And we've seen wars rolled out on the back of this demonization of Islam. You saw Salman Rushdie was the preemptory strike, where the satanic verses became the background music, the mood music for what was to follow. Because framing Islam as intolerant, as burning books, and as hating, Western ideas, or hating freedom of speech, such things became a narrative which was kicked off very early on. So I've got to frame it, I think, initially in that sense, because most of the Islamic world, ideologically, politically, socially, is basically on the defensive. It has been under assault from various quarters. The primary one, of course, being this imperialist interest. But Islam itself, at its core, having set aside the politicized, weaponized, and negative version, which has been pumped out by Western establishment elites. In its essence, Islam is actually a liberation ideology. It's an ideology which emerged in the 7th century. More than an ideology, it was a way of life that emerged in the 7th century, patterned and based on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who was the transmitter of the final testament, the final revelation, according to us Muslims. And this revelation is the book which is the basis on which Muslims run their lives, or are supposed to, and even as a Muslim state is supposed to run its affairs, because it has prescriptions for every aspect of life, from personal to the public, and to the state, and to society. So it's a really complex subject. We could spend hours discussing it, but in a nutshell, some of its fundamentals are essentially justice and zakat, two that I'll take out as fundamental pillars, if you like, which all Muslims adhere to or subscribe to. Justice, of course, speaks for itself, because that in itself, as a core ideal, means that actually then Islam can be held up to the light based on its notions of justice, and how it perhaps it has been implemented by some of so-called Muslims, and how it's failed to be implemented by a lot of them as well. So I'd say that justice is nonetheless a core principle of actual Islam. We're not talking about Muslims or people who say they're Muslims, or they are whatever they say they are. Islam definitely totally subscribes to justice, and it also subscribes, of course, to this concept of zakat, which is charity and the idea of giving to the poor and the needy. And whilst it's a very small amount, 2.5% of your basically of your wealth is meant to go towards this charity, in reality, Islam actually encourages people to give of their own volition, not be forced to give just this tax or this charity to the poor, but they're meant to give it in abundance. The whole point of the next world is that you are generous, kind, forgiving, and loving and compassionate in this world. So that's part of that entire, if you like, virtue ethics value base which Islam brings with it. And I think this is a really important aspect which quite often even Muslims will overlook, because whilst they say, believing in one God, believing the Prophet Muhammad as the final messenger of God, prayer and this zakat and Hajj, going back to the pilgrimage of the divine, those are all sort of semi-metaphysical aspects of Islam, but they're also practical ones once you get to the justice and the zakat. And the prayer is kind of the connection point between the practical life that we lead and the metaphysical reality of the divine. And I think this is one of the fundamental things which perhaps is hard for some Westerners to understand, because the West went through its gestation period of rejecting institutional Christianity as a power that ruled virtually Western society during the Enlightenment. So there's been a process of enlightenment which the West likes to think is all about rationalism and is about philosophically rejecting. It's also about justice. It's also about equality. Those were the aspirations of the Enlightenment, and it was a rejection of the corrupt power of the time, the monarchies and the church. So the framework for modern Westerners is that religion shouldn't have anything to do with politics. It should not be in the realm of politics, but secularism, which emerges, is meant to protect the rights of the religious people, I guess, within a certain legal framework and from a justice point of view. So, Muslims aren't necessarily against secularism per se in that sense, and that which comes from it, whether it's socialism, even aspects of capitalism. It's interesting that Islam has elements of all of these things, and Islam isn't an ism in that sense. It's not subject to these movements that have emerged in the West, which are currently having, of course, the controlling say. Secular neoliberalism, particularly now, is really in the ascendancy, and even socialism, many would argue, is being pushed back true socialism, for instance, and capitalism has been hijacked by neoliberal capitalism, hyper-capitalism, based on pure greed. So there are lots of things to discuss around this, but Islam has something to say on all of these things. Islamic socialism is a thing as well. Muslim socialists have emerged over the years who have justified their interaction with Western isms or institutions or movements or ideologies on the basis that actually they're rooted in the Quran, because the Quran, as I said, fundamentally talks about these issues. And what's really interesting is for Muslims, they also have a couple of really important references in history that they can fall back on if they really want to clarify what Islamic values are and what the ideology really is. And that is the personality and character of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which is pretty well, probably the most recorded history of any individual in the world, is Prophet Muhammad. There are so many books written on him, so many sayings, hadith, that there's a wealth of knowledge on what we call the seerah of the Prophet. So these actions of the Prophet are not only relevant to him as an individual, how he lived, but he was, of course, a statesman and a leader for 10 years, around 10 years. The latter part of his life was spent as the leader of a state, the state of Medina, and then which also expanded beyond into the Hijaz and beyond in Arabia. So the template of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, in unison with the Quran, becomes a source of, it becomes a template for Muslims to basically say, this is what an ideal state might look like. And I'll give you an idea of the kind of breadth of political, economic, social, and cultural, if you like, ideas that emanate both from the Quran and the Prophet a little more. One, for instance, would be in Medina. The Prophet Muhammad established what was known as a hima, a kind of an environmental conservation area. So environmental conservation in a desert land where water needed to be conserved, where animals needed to be protected. Well, he was way ahead of his time in that sense, because he actually did nurture that and made it a policy that you couldn't hunt or chop trees or destroy the vegetation in a particular range of areas. It was protected, again, legally. So, he had an environmental policy, which was very, very clear. In terms of economics, I can tell you that when he first took over Medina, and he was invited to take over leadership in the town or city of Medina, because he was exiled from Mecca, which is his birthplace, because people didn't like his ideas of social justice, about equality, about tackling poverty, and about being fair, and to really also counter some of the tribal dominance and arrogance that was going on in his part of the world at that time. So they basically ejected him on pain of death, and his followers, and he ended up in Medina because he was invited to become the arbiter or the judge or the leader of Medina. And there he began to implement these Quranic concepts and ideas. So the environmental sustainability concept, for instance. He also initiates, for instance, in the markets, they were dominated by Medinan Jews. So the Jewry in Medina dominated most of the marketplace. They were the major tradesmen. They controlled most of the production in and around Medina, all the date groves and the various other food that was produced in Medina. Again, water was a scarcity, but they had the access to the areas where it was most easy to do such things. And they basically were monopolizing and basically also charging whatever they wanted. And the desert Arabs and the more nomadic Arabs that were around there, or even the ones that were living in Medina, all relied on their production, their food. And Prophet Muhammad came in, recognized that there was a problem here. There was the problems he saw were usury, number one, so exploitation of people through money lending, and he completely abolished that. He tackled the issue of only one marketplace dominated by the same kind of economic leaders. In this instance, it was largely the Jewish fraternity with some of the Arabs, no doubt, as well. But they were all monopolizing and controlling the marketplace. So what he did was he opened a market, and he didn't charge the tax to the new shopkeepers. He taught them how to bring in food from other places or goods and products. So he created competition. And that competition created a more even playing field, and it helped to reduce prices. And of course, this annoyed a lot of the established monopolizers. But he did it because these were Quranic instructions. These were the implementation of that. So you can see I've just given you two examples of how the Prophet Muhammad, with the ideas of justice and virtue and ethics and morality that were rooted in the Quran, actually begins to apply them in the real world. Not only on a personal level, but as a statesman, as a leader. Now, in essence, this is what Islam is actually about. You know, it is about these kinds of things. It's not how Muslims have always rolled it out. I'm afraid they also fell foul of the temptation for imperialism in much of their history. But if we're talking about Islam as an ideological and a spiritual and a religious ideal, then this is what it is. That's the period you have to look at for its most pure implementation, I would say.
That's a fantastic introduction for anyone who's not aware of the core tenets of the Islamic faith as brought forward by the Prophet Muhammad. Very interesting what you're saying, you see, because this is what I picked up with when I was in Karbala, this whole idea of social justice, which is what you've just touched on. I hear you speaking about equality, about a type of ending of exploitation and oppression, which is what I, as a socialist, would believe is how the world should be. We should be as equal as possible. There should be a fair distribution of wealth and resources among the people so that everyone can aspire to a certain standard of living and not have this huge gap between the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor, which has got worse through neoliberalism brought through from Reagan and from Margaret Thatcher from 1979 on. So we've talked about the religious and the spiritual aspect, and from what I heard in Kampala and what I've heard from you, it sounds anti-capitalist and it sounds more in line with social values and indeed humanitarian values where people are respected and not oppressed. I get fully what you're saying about the Islamophobia. You mentioned Salman Rushdie. What came into my mind straight away was Charlie Hebdo. All those they are able to call it freedom of the press to derogate and demonize and devalue other human beings and their religious beliefs. And then whenever there was the tragic murder at Charlie Hebdo, then you had all the world leaders in fact, a lot of them in the photograph I saw or the video, it was like AI. A lot of these world leaders weren't actually there, but they were kind of superimposed into the photograph to show this world revulsion. And they're not there for Palestine. They're not there for Lebanon. They're not there for Syria. We're watching what's happening in Tbilisi, another Maidan Mark II. So I'd maybe like to delve just slightly further into the whole idea of imperialism, which uses division as a tool of conquest. We see the division in Islam between Shia and Sunni. We see, funnily enough, that it is the Shias who have come to the aid of the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians, if I'm correct, are Sunni by their religion, but it's Iran, it's the PMUs in Iraq, it's the Yemenis, and it's Hezbollah, who are all Shia Muslims who have come to the aid of their Sunni brothers and sisters, but not, I would suggest, in a religious, what would you call that, where they, in a religious sense, where they feel it's a duty to come to their aid. I believe that if this was happening somewhere else in the Middle East or West Asia, they would quite possibly do the same, come to the aid of any nation that's suffering under genocide, not because of their religious tenets. Well, yes, because of their religious tenets, because it's a core part of their religious being. So could you maybe describe to us why there is a schism which is being exploited by the West between Shia and the Sunni Muslim religions, and also the Takfiri and the Salafists, because it appears to be the Takfiris that are in Syria that are beheading men, women and children, Christians, Muslims and secular people on the same kind of scale and the same kind of inhumanity as the Zionist apartheid fascist regime from Tel Aviv, with the go-ahead from America and the West, or continuing in Gaza and in Lebanon as we speak?
Well, yes, divide and rule has been a fundamental pillar of certainly modern day Western imperialism, British colonialism, and you can go back to the books of Machiavelli to look at where a lot of this philosophy has been implemented. But it's not exclusive to the West. It's something the East has also adopted, and indeed Muslims have adopted these kinds of strategies. But today we have to focus on colonialism and neo-colonialism, because they have been the dominant imperialist examples over the last 200 to 300 years, and they've impacted the world and they've shaped the world that we all live in. And today they continue to try and shape that world, because the hegemons that have emerged in the Western capitals have had most of the resources, because they plundered the resources from the rest of the world, and then they gathered them in the coffers of not the people, not even the states necessarily in the West. They're gathered in places like the City of London, where the Corporation of London rules the roost. Not the British government doesn't rule the Corporation of London. They have an entire body of laws that govern them. They have an entire financial setup, which the British government can't even go and they just don't have the right to be able to go and scrutinize them. We've literally in this country got a nation within a nation. We've got a state within a state. We have an onshore tax haven, if you like, and a money laundering system within a square mile of London, and yet nobody even bats an eyelid. In fact, that corporation sits in the supposed center of power here, Westminster, with a chap called the Remembrancer, who sits right next to the Speaker, and he records all the conversations that go on one way or another in Parliament, and reports back to the Corporation of London, which answers primarily to global corporate imperialist power, money power, you know. So we've got a situation where the British people, Western people, it's the same perhaps exists in Wall Street, though I know the Corporation of London far better. So we've got a problem in the democracies in the West, which are not real democracies. They're oligarchies, which impose a hyper-capitalism, which divide and rule people here as well. They bribe people, and they carry out disinformation campaigns. They manipulate the government. They orchestrate the electoral systems. And of course, this goes into what people are told is conspiracy theory. But first of all, conspiracy theory is a CIA term. It was coined by them in order to discredit anybody who actually asks too many questions and comes up with, gets a bit too close to the truth. But the fact, Fry, is that these things are all provable. There's nothing conspiracy about Remembrance or the City of Corporate. You can go and do your homework if you bother and go and look and see whatever I'm saying, if it's true or not. But there are these cartels which dominate the world, and they do carry huge influence within political circles, because they're the ones who give the MPs, for instance, here stipends. They'll give them little bonuses at the end of their careers. They have corporations boards they go and sit on. They have special access to lobbying of parliamentarians and pushing agendas, which the ordinary person doesn't have. So straight away, democracy becomes negated when you have a system which actually is far more influenced during the course of a government's duration by moneylender corporates, and it excludes the people who don't get to vote again for another 4 or 5 years, and then are manipulated into voting for two-party states, which basically don't have a difference in policies. Currently, the situation with Labour and Tory. So my first point is that we have a big problem in the West. We're the first victims of this imperialism and this kind of exploitation, this hyper-capitalism, which actually also then is financing forever wars in West Asia. And those forever wars that they finance that you hinted at, they are there for plunder purposes and for colonization and for control. They plunder oil, they plunder gas, they plunder uranium. They want to get them at the cheapest rates possible, and they bribe people, they coerce certain leaders, they fund and arm certain forces and powers that can come into power. They bankroll elections of certain people, even in the fake democracies. They support despots and kings and monarchs in the Muslim world particularly. And I think that this trend is something which continues from what all imperialistic powers have done in the past, that they've been opportunistic, and they will use religion, they will use nationalism, they'll use ethnicity, they will use gender, they will use all sorts of means, and they will weaponize those things. They'll use religion in terms of sectarianism, for instance, to divide. The more division there is, the more they can manipulate situations. And in the Muslim world, what you referred to in terms of the Shia-Sunni divide, there wasn't that much of any violence, if you like, over the last 300-400 years prior to the colonialists going into those regions between Sunnis and Shias. They'd kind of largely come to an agreement, and there was an understanding, and there was certainly everybody was kind of getting on with their own faith in the way that they wanted, and the Ottomans and the Safavids and the more latter-day imperialists didn't really go on huge purges on a sectarian basis. Now there's not that much evidence to suggest that, although in the past, of course, it was used by imperialists as well in order to pit one people against another. The same thing the Ottomans would have done in their initial years against the Safavids. Both were they were cousin dynasties, but one adopted Shiism as a faith to separate themselves from the Sunnism of the Ottomans. So as two imperialist rivals, it suited them to have people who were also religiously separate, other and ethnically separate, and so they were games that were played, no doubt. But at its core, the sectarianism which is being exploited today is very manufactured. So the likes of the Wahhabi, for instance, fraternity in Saudi Arabia, they're the hub of most of the sectarianism that has emerged, which the West has used, because the Saudis and all of the Khaliji Arab monarchs were placed in power by the British. They were left in power, they were placed in power and kept in power and now maintained in power by the British, followed by the Americans who followed the British lead. And they did it because they knew they had oil. They discovered oil in the 20s or something, and they set about making sure they would control that oil asset. So they decided they were going to use oil and gas as their main means of industrial production and driving their economies. So they needed puppets in that part of the world who they could control and who would siphon the oil wealth to them at the minimum cost and in the most guaranteed way. And that's exactly what they've had for us. And now the thing that's caused a problem is that Islamic Republic of Iran, probably for the first time in Islamic history for over maybe 1,000 years plus, has emerged and re-identified itself with the original prophetic liberation theology, if you like, the liberation, Islamic liberation ideology of the Prophet Muhammad and of his family. And this is what you saw in Karbala when you went. What you see is the product of a people who are absolutely committed to individuals who died and sacrificed their whole life, all their family, everything for this jihad. Jihad means striving, it means struggle. A struggle for good. That's the terminology of jihad. It's not just going to war, but it's struggling in every shape and form, whether you're struggling with the pen or with the word or the tongue or with weapons against tyranny, against oppression. And I think that people all vibe with this, and they all love Imam Hussein al-Islam there in Karbala or Imam Ali in Najaf, because they are the what's known as the purified household of Prophet Muhammad. His daughter, Hazrat Fatima, Salamullah alayhi, Imam Ali, her husband, who was the right hand, the first person to come to Islam, and he was also the greatest supporter. And their two children, not all their children, two, were selected within the Quran to be purified in a way which said that basically this becomes your model family. You see, it's very important, and Muslims don't even know this, a lot of them. They won't even understand this, that you can have one man who comes up and says, I am here to deliver a message to you, and I am the perfect man, and everybody should basically follow me because I'm following this divine word. Well, one man is never really a template for society. The fundamental core template for society is a family. When you have a family, and the interaction between that family, then going to an extended family, and then extending into a community, that's when you have a social engagement and you have a system. Now, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on his own, as a personality, could have advocated a system, could have proselytized a system of justice and whatever else Islam that stands for. But it was the actual personification of that system in his household, and everything that they did, from the life of the Prophet Muhammad as a youngster, when he stood up for the rights of the traders in Mecca, when he stood up for the Hilf al-Fadul movement, which was an economic rights movement which fought for the weaker tradesmen to have equality. From that moment on to when he becomes prophet and implements this entire system, and then on to Imam Ali and his daughter, and their exemplification of the same values of the Quran, actually personifying them, and their two grandsons. The latter one, of course, who is martyred along with all his family and the close associates at a battle which was he was up against the imperialist king who had emerged in his time, Yazid. And so Yazid represents everything that Islam is not. He represents tyranny, imperialism, greed, avarice. He represents materialism in its kind of absolutely worst and vile form. And Imam Hussein represents, he represents a commitment to justice and all that is virtuous and good in this world, but actually his emphasis is very much about the next world. And this is where I think Islam has that slight separation from some of the modern ideologies in the West, like socialism, perhaps, because the emphasis on spiritual, emphasis on the other world or the metaphysical world is an area which largely socialism kind of leaves people to people's individual tastes, whereas Islam actually incorporates it as a part of the life, because we say basically the balance of life is not just with what is material, but it has to be balanced with what is non-material, i.e. things of the heart, things of the soul, things that are related to the unseen. You know, nowadays modern physics talks about dark matter, and we talk about gravity, and we talk about all those things that we can't see, and we can't necessarily prove them all through science either. A lot of it is just theory. But Islam is very much rooted in the unseen as well. And it's not just about what we do in this material world. In this material world, all that we do in terms of sacrifice, love, yes, it's done for the sake of humanity, because it is the right thing to do. It's intrinsically the right morality to have, to help someone who's poor, to lift up somebody who's handicapped, to help the aged, you know, to do good. This is also a moral, I think it's a moral, intrinsic morality which actually exists even with a little child. With even a baby, a young child, you'll see it where they have an understanding of morality and immorality, good and bad, stealing things from somebody else. But then it's of course compounded by how we then raise the child. But Islam talks about this fitra, this intrinsic morality, and this natural ethical status, and it speaks about our journey leading to doing all these good things being something which won't just die with us. They live on in eternity, and they also mean something in the next world. And you see, the other framing, of course, is that the men like Yazid and men like, say, Churchill, for instance, or men like Hitler, or, you know, I mentioned Churchill because he was responsible for 11 million deaths by famine of Bengalis in 1947, because he didn't give them the wheat that was theirs, and he handed it to the military, the British military in the West, as part of their post-war effort or something. So he was also a genocidal killer. let's put it that way. Hitler was in his own way, but I like to sort of play even, and Yazid was, and we've had our share of killers like that as well. So it's not an exclusive thing to people who call themselves capitalists or socialists or Muslim. People have killed in the name of religion and non-religion equally merrily. But we are opposed to all of that at the heart of Islam. And the idea is that we're also committed to brotherhood, because Imam Ali says your commitment is to your brother in faith. Two people you have commitment to. One is your brother in faith, the other is your brother in humanity. And your commitment to them is equal. Islam, when it takes on a society, it's not meant to discriminate. For instance, even the imperialist Islamic states, the ones that I don't necessarily like, let alone the Prophet's one, the idea was that if you weren't a Muslim, you were obliged to pay a dhimmi tax. But that was because you didn't have to serve in the army. and you didn't have to give the same kind of contribution to society that a Muslim did. It was a Muslim's job to protect and defend you, the borders. It wasn't an obligation for those who were under Muslim law. So you see, even where there were these kinds of things, there was a kind of justice and equity thinking behind it. That, you know, and these things, I would say, are just touching on some of the aspects of what Islam is about. And as far as the sectarian thing goes, as I said, the Saudi Wahhabi political tool, or their ideology and the state, was used primarily just to protect Western interests, just as Israel was left in that region. So Saudi Arabia and its various despots were there to do this. And what they wanted was to create differences deliberately, because that's what they love doing. They know that sooner or later people will wake up. So when people do wake up, you need some power, some ability to keep them divided. So emotional, religious beliefs, if they are unleashed upon an unlettered, illiterate people who don't know their own religion, then become very dangerous. And this is what's happened with Wahhabism and the madrasas that popped up and all this, the Zionist Western-backed finance of this through the petrodollars and through the dinars of the Arabs. They've created this kind of fake Muslim ideology, Wahhabism, which then becomes Salafism, which then is infiltrated into the likes of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, and then becomes ISIS, becomes Al-Qaeda, becomes Jabhat al-Nusra, and it becomes all of these agents and proxies that can be used for the purposes of Western imperialism in the Middle East to make sure that chaos is there, and it serves the interests of the Westerners and American governments, etc., in particular, for their purposes of plunder. So that is what the sectarianism is really about. I could go into the historically why there are subtle differences between Shias and Sunnis, and there are differences, but they are very minimal compared to the way they sometimes are projected by this propaganda machine, and this manufactured fifth column of what I call fifth column among Muslims, which is largely the Takfiri fraternity, who basically say all other Muslims are kafirs, they're unbelievers, and they should be put to the sword. And that's the kind of ideology which it's nurtured by the West in order to create the chaos. And you see that chaos in Syria today. The guys who they're using as proxies there are exactly of that ideology. They use them also in Iraq to invade through ISIS. They use them in Pakistan to create terrorism within that country. They use them against Iran, of course, as proxies. And they've used them in Libya to overturn Gaddafi. Wherever they've needed to destroy a nation, you see that these proxies are employed, and because they are brainwashed from childhood, they're given money, they're nurtured by certain hateful ideologies, and their primary targets are usually Muslims. They're not Westerners. They have killed more Muslims, infinitely more Muslims than they have any Westerners. But they've been used in the West to discredit Islam, because that's what Islam is packaged as a terror package. And they've been used in the Muslim world to maintain American hold and plunder.
It's amazing. Thank you very much for that. I had just a couple of thoughts when I was listening to what you were saying there. One of them is fear. Fear is one of the huge tools in the imperialist capitalist box that they can bring out. They always have to have a bogeyman. There always has to be someone who is a hate figure. Someone, you had Saddam Hussein, 3 minutes he could launch these chemical weapons on London, etc., etc. All the tissue of lies, all blatant propaganda to create the narrative to allow people to say, oh, well, we must do something about this. We can't possibly be under threat ourselves. And it's a win-win for the West and for the imperialists who help create these ISIS terrorists in order to use them to destabilize the countries that they have in their sights for regime change. So they use them on one level for a campaign of murder and havoc and instilling terror and fear in the targeted subject areas, the people who live in the countries that they want the regime change in. And as you quite rightly said, that is then used to say, here's your enemy. These people who cut out hearts in Aleppo and eat them, these are Muslims. This is what you'll do. This is what they'll do to you. I've heard EU leaders talk about the EU as the kind of the garden of humanity, and everything else outside by implication is a jungle. The jungle being the non-EU, non-white, non-Anglo-Saxon community. I'd like to thank you very much. That's nearly 40 minutes, and I could talk to you all day, brother. I really mean that, but 40 minutes is maybe enough for our viewers, and we'll get to talk again at another stage. But I'll look forward to following your social media work and seeing you again on Press TV. And is there a website or something that you'd like people to maybe visit if they get an opportunity?
Well, the Free Palestine Film Festival is one of the projects that I'm very much pushing now, and we've also got a petition out now, which is basically opposing the war on Palestine as well, which I can provide links at some stage. But basically, we're going to be also launching a podcast very soon, which I'm sure when I come on, I'll be inviting you onto, and other friends. But I think it's very much part of our conscious desire, and it's a necessity of the time that we build bridges, not fake interfaith bridges like the controlled political interfaith that's been going on from the government during the counter-terrorism campaigns, but a kind of a genuine understanding of each other. As somebody who's grown up in the West, I understand both sides of the coin, understand the fears that are being created and the distance. So our job is really to bring people together, not around lies, but with honest discourse. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity and this platform to begin that kind of conversation. But it's a really important conversation between East and West, between Muslim and non-Muslim, that must be done, because there's so many platforms which are creating the hate out there. We need to bring humanity together, and Islam is about that. It's fundamentally about bringing people together, not about discriminating or destroying at all.
Well, thank you very much, and I totally agree with you. I think the more people who get to speak their truth out into the public domain, the more we can share common interests. You'll have a different audience from the audience I potentially have. The very fact that we're having this conversation around, I do see, when I heard people like President Raisi speak in Iran, I heard the voice of Che Guevara. I heard Patrice Lumumba. I heard Allende in Chile. So for me, that's why I feel an affinity and a brotherhood with the people in Islam who follow the true tenets of the core aspects of the religion. I'll see you again sometime, and I'd like to thank you again for joining us.
Look forward to it.
Thank you very much.